Okay, well, welcome back to our online training sessions for policy and regulation. And as you know, we are here, me, Len, Laura, Ricardo, as part of the consortium that is implementing Go Energy Transition Community Project. And there is two sets of trainings happening right now on the policy and regulation. This is the third week that we're in, and we're discussing different aspects of political, legislative, regulatory, and institutional framework needed for energy transition. And in this context, we're discussing good practices, we're discussing challenges, what are some of the levers and actions that you could do to move forward with the energy transition, with some examples from the different islands across Europe, but also across the world. After this training session, you will get a training certificate, and the presentations as well as the recordings of these trainings will be available on the Go platform. And there is also an evaluation form, which is shared with you, as you know by now, after each of the trainings. So you can let us know what is your opinion and what is it that you want to see more or less during these training sessions. As I mentioned earlier, this is the third week of the training. So this is the sixth training in the series of 8 trainings. Last 2 weeks, we were discussing different aspects of energy policy, energy planning, strategic planning, action plans, evaluation and monitoring. And this week, we'll dive into the regulation. Today, we'll be discussing regulation principles. Tomorrow, we'll be discussing tariffing and the design of the tariffs. And then on Thursday, we'll be discussing the regulation needed for renewable energy efficiency implementation. So without further ado, today, this is the agenda. So after a short introduction from my side, Len will go into the presentation on regulation principles. So introduction to regulation with some interactive aspect on the Miro board. And then we'll have 2 presentations today from external speakers. So we'll have Ginny Nicolai, who is the Director of Energy and Telecommunications of the Government of Bermuda. And she'll be talking to us about the importance of the regulatory framework for energy transition. And then we'll come back a bit more on the regulation principles with Len. And then we continue on to a really nice example from Terry Nielsen, who's head of R&D Department of Electrical Power Company of Faroe Islands. And he'll be talking to us about integrating renewables on Faroe Islands within their power system and heading towards 100% renewables for 2030. And we'll have some time for questions and discussion. As you know by now, please feel free during this whole session to interrupt, to turn on your mic, your video, to ask questions, and also in the chat to ask your questions. Yeah? All right. Well, I stop here. If there is
Lucia, I'm going to be annoying because I have the big screen. Yeah, you will be sharing my presentation. So for all the participants, I briefly showed you the better regulation guidelines last week. If we don't manage to go through it today, we did prepare a presentation on it with the necessary links, so you will receive it anyhow. And then if needed, we can come back to it later in the sessions, either tomorrow or after tomorrow, but just to make sure that you have it as well, that is prepared for you.
All right, you should be able to see the presentation now.
Yes, okay. You can give me the next slide, please. So what I did in this presentation is we start with diving in first a bit on what is a regulator, because some of you have a regulator, others don't have it. And I think, Jeannie, if you're going to talk about Bermuda, what would be really interesting is how you set it up in the beginning. I know that you were guided in setting up the regulator, I think, by the company Oxona, if I'm right. I don't know whether Jeannie is already here. If not, I'm a bit talking in a void. She's not yet here.
Yeah, she's not here yet.
Yeah, but I hope that she can dive into that aspect as well, because some of you indeed don't yet have a regulator. So understanding how you can be guided, what these companies offer you and what not would be, I think, useful for all of you. Then we dive into the principles of regulation. a few things that you have to keep in mind. Either, as some of you, or a regulator is never a finished thing. It's always in evolution. So if you want to change it, if you want to expand or adjust it, what are the principles of regulation? Who do you typically involve when setting up the regulator? What is the role of a regulator? Then literally setting it up, starting from for it, and then building a credible regulatory arrangement. We will come back to some aspects in the following days. We're not going to dive today into price settings because that's going to be the topic of tomorrow. And they're going to be also on, I think, Thursday, we're going to dive into what is a regulatory sandbox. So how do you experiment with a regulation, especially when you want to try new technologies or you want to try new concepts of collaboration, for example, then you typically set up a regulatory sandbox, which is kind of a piloting phase. So we're not going to discuss that today because that's for the rest of the week, Lucia. We're going to a Miro board exercise first. It's a short exercise where we want you to exchange a bit experiences. So be vocal. Is especially targeted to the ones that already have a regulator. Lucia, could you share the link to the Miro board?
Lane, I have a question.
Yeah.
By regulator, you mean department that is in charge for establishing prices for the energy sector? That's what
it's much more, actually. But we'll dive into the definition afterwards, but it's actually much more than establishing what the prices are, but the prices are typically an important aspect of it. But it could be linked to procedures. Let's say we have one rule in Belgium that's really common that says that you cannot connect devices behind the meter. So if I would be the neighbor of which gladly I'm not, seriously, if I would be the neighbor of Lucia and I would be connecting my PV installation also to her installation, that is where the regulator says, no, we don't allow that because, first of all, it's a safety issue. If then someone comes to Lucia's house and think, okay, I did disconnect the house, so I can work safely now, and then I start producing PV, then there would be voltage measured on Lucia's installation, and that could hurt a person. So there's multiple reasons why you typically would not allow that, and so that's typically a regulatory aspect. Things like DC grids instead of AC grids can also be a regulatory aspect. But indeed, price settings is an important aspect, but it's much, much more. It is literally what is allowed, what is not allowed, impact studies, but also, for example, the progress on how do you increase efficiency of the operation of the grid, these kind of things.
Maybe, Len, due to this question, it might be good that we go through the few slides on what is regulator first, and then we dive into the Miro board so that we're all on the same page.
Fine as well. I'm completely flexible.
Yeah, because I asked because it was not clear for me what I should answer if you ask me. We have that. You understand? That's why. So maybe
Lucia, then you can go for me.
Also, what do you have against being my neighbor?
That is just, we'll discuss it separately. I need slide 5.
Yes, I'm on it.
So, very broadly, it supervises the operation of the electricity market. And electricity market, it's more, it's the system, but it also who can connect to what. And just to explain the diverse systems of it, generally on islands, you're in an easier situation until now. You had either fossil fuels completely, or there was fossil fuels with a minor amount of renewables, but it was often coming from one supplier. Now, as soon as you are allowing multiple suppliers and multiple assets, you really have to set up that market. And that market is complex. It is about who do I allow for which price? So it's about bidding as well. And if you really go to complex markets where there are multiple suppliers, where you can, even offer cross-border electricity if you're connected with a cable to another island, then you start to have something that is really complicated in the sense of you have something called a stock market where you can bid on, the 24 ahead, but then also, so I was reading Robert's comment. So you can bid 24 hours ahead, but you have to readjust it because your clients, if you're a supplier, might be consuming less or more, and you have to guarantee that you buy the necessary amount. So the regulator supervises the operation, but also the rules related to that. Indeed, Lucia, next one. The other thing is, they can issue opinions about certain aspects. And coming back to what we had earlier last week, or the week before even, on energy communities, this is where they can provide an opinion. And they say, well, in our opinion and based on our assessment, energy communities should or should not get a reduction in the tariff. I think we'll come back to that later as well. They can provide their approval to certain documents, which could be, for example, the grid development plan. So what you typically have is that a regulator who's already established for a while is going to, you could say force, but it's actually help the utility to improve its efficiency in maybe also the operation, but generally also the grid efficiency. Yeah? Some of the islands among you had an efficiency in the grid of about 17%. Others had a grid efficiency of, a grid loss, I'm sorry, of 17%, and others had a grid loss of about 5%. Typically, it's very difficult if you're the only utility on the island to convince the policymakers that you need a long-term investment plan, because you as a utility have a long horizon, but that policymaker is typically only there for 4 to 6 years. So convincing the policymaker that long-term investment is needed to reduce the losses in the grid is often challenging. And this is where a regulator can really be on your side to say, okay, we need a grid investment plan so that we move to a more efficient grid operation. And this is what is typically in the grid development plan. Then what is also needed is to make sure that that regulator is clearly positioned compared to the government. That means that the government will actually have to write down in the legal framework what is the freedom and the area of operation of the regulator. So there must be a political will allowing the regulator to do their job and not being overruled by the policymakers. So an energy regulator is honestly something flexible. And I think I wrote that on the next slide, but I'm not sure. So what they typically do as activities is issuing licenses related to regulatory functions. And that can be allowing a new, let's say a new supplier to act on the market, checking whether he has the right certifications to do that. Lucia, the next one. Setting performance standards, which is what I said earlier. I can literally, as a regulator, say, okay, we need you to reduce the grid losses, because the grid losses is, of course, a waste of energy, and that is definitely something that needs to be avoided. So I can set performance standards, but I can also do the monitoring and the performance of regulated firms. That literally means I can check whether the utility literally confirms with what we agreed, whether the costs they claim or their effective costs. Okay, Lucia. The level and the structure of the tariff, that's an important one as well. And tomorrow you will get a session which will be delivered through DNV, who has experts really diving into the details of tariffs. But to just give you an idea how difficult the topic is, you could say, okay, what is included in the tariff is clearly the costs related to operating the grid, which includes the losses, which includes replacing substations, replacing cables, putting smart meters. Metering costs are not always included, but then you have other costs, which could be the salary costs of the utility. It could be related to the pension of the people working for the utility. It could be costs related to alleviating energy poverty, ensuring that if people can't pay for their connection, that they still can get a minimum amount of energy. I will provide you the slides as well that we prepared for the French session tomorrow, because we went to look into what throughout the world is included in the costs, and sometimes it's hilarious. To give you an idea, when the Italian government needs money, they might put an extra element in the grid tariff to collect some extra money, and then the year afterwards, it's gone again. So the tariffs are not only used to cover the costs that typically would be covered by regulatory supervision, but it also includes a number of political aspects. Things also included are often subsidies to renewables. So establishing the level and the structure of the tariff is one thing. Lucia, the next.
Len, there is a question from Andrea.
Yeah, I can't see it. Andrea.
I don't know if you're gonna address this, so I'm just gonna ask it right away. Maybe you will. So, are you gonna, or are we gonna address also the issue of legally if the regulator has to have a certain legal independence from the government or not? And
yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
And so the link that you see here at the bottom of the slide is a document that was set up by the University of Florida, who really works on doing that. And it is set up really to design an independent regulatory commission in a more challenging environment than what you typically work in. So it's actually a very good reference document. It is targeted towards African countries who publicly admit that corruption is an issue, and that is where that comes in to really be able to work independently. So you can go down in to that document as well, but I use that as a basis so that you can build on that and it's recognizable. But indeed, that independence, that room to be allowed to do what you do is really important. Then the next thing, they're allowed, not always though, is arbitrating disputes among stakeholders. Let's say among the utility and a supplier who wants to set up a certain plant. And then the supplier might say, I don't want to do this, whatever. And the stakeholder who wants to implement a power plant, being a wind turbine or something else, might say, but I align with all the procedures, and this is typically where the regulator would play a role. Of course, if it really goes up, then it goes to court. But the idea is that we first aim to solve it at the level of the regulator. Then what I already said, it can do audits to see whether the claimed costs are actually the actual costs on the regulated firms being typically the DSO and the TSO, so the distribution system operator and the transmission system operator. Usually, and even in countries in Europe, this is done by an independent consultancy because it's a tough job, and it generally only happens when either in the beginning had to establish a benchmark, or when there is the assumption that there is some fraud in the claimed numbers. Then reporting, of course, the activities to the appropriate government authority. That's an important one because it's actually not only to the appropriate government authority, but the level of detail to the authority might be different than what you offer to the public. I'm just going to see in the slides what's coming next. Yeah, maybe Lucia, the next slide as well before we go to the Miro board. And that's an important, the perfect energy regulator doesn't exist. So I think one of you last week said we are in the stage of revising what the regulator is going to do. I don't remember it was this session or it was the French session, but it's very important to know that the perfect energy regulator does not exist. It simply doesn't, because you continuously have to improve and make adjustments aligning with internal and external changes. And that can be anything. Internal changes can be how you organize the market, or where you see that you actually need to focus on something more deeply, or there's something that you shouldn't pick up, some other organization should pick up. External changes can be, you know, an investor coming in, more investors having an interest in investing in your island, in the energy system. And then the question is, do you allow it? Do you not allow it? It's an important question to ask, just as a reference. Chinese companies are very interested in taking over utilities. But of course, if you allow that, they also have geopolitical power over your power system. So it's not unimportant to really think about how you assure that you keep the ownership and the power over how your electricity and energy system is working. But external changes could be, the others coming to your island and saying, okay, we're interested. Or it could be the coming up of a new technology. Like if everyone on the island would start using home batteries, that's an external change. It's a new technology that comes in. So I don't know who asked the question, but does this help to answer the questions on that were, I don't even know which questions we had, to be honest. So I have to go to the Miro board, which some of you are already on. I'm just going to make it a bit bigger.
Do you want me to share it?
Yes, yes. You're more handy with it than me with the big screen here.
Here we go.
Yeah. So we're going to go to the green one first. Thank you, Lucia. So who in the group has a regulator? I know Bermuda has one.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So if you go back to, I think in your case, not that long ago, why did you decide to set it up?
So thank you. I do apologize for joining late. I was having some difficulty with my connection. In any case, I was going to say we decided to set one up for a couple of reasons. One, the biggest reason is because it inspires market confidence or investor confidence.
Yes.
And we wanted to ensure that we would have a more or as robust a regulatory environment as possible so that regulators would feel comfortable. We have challenges in our jurisdiction as throughout the rest of the Caribbean, where we're not perceived as being good risks for investors. Not so much Bermuda, but very much in the other islands.
Yeah. Okay. And then I know, I think you were guided by the company Oxona, right?
Yes, in part.
Yeah. So which steps do you take? I mean, you decide at a certain moment is necessary. So what's the first thing you're going to do?
Well, the first thing that we did was we established a relationship with a consultant, and so that you have to make a decision early on, and sometimes that decision is made for you. You have to make a decision early on as to whether or not or what countries' regulations you're going to align with. So, are we going to be more American, more North American in our regulation? How is our business? Is it more North American? Are we likely to have North American investors? So try to have a think about where your service providers are going to come from, where your utility providers are going to come from.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the first step. So we wound up with kind of a blend, really. So some of our regulation is a bit North American, some is a bit more European or British, but for the most part, it's very North American.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so who helped you? You said partly it was a consultant. Others that helped you, or exchanges that helped you a lot?
Yes. So we actually hired a law firm, and in retrospect, everything is always clearer when you're looking in the rearview mirror. But we began a relationship with a legal firm, and they'd done a lot of litigation in the field, so they could tell us categorically what we wanted, kind of the pitfalls that we wanted to avoid. I don't know at that time that we had a lot of interchange with other jurisdictions like ours, and that was perhaps a bit of a misstep. I think that we would have gained much more insight from working more closely with our regional counterparts.
Yeah. So that's something that we hear a lot, exchanges with peers. Even before you start diving into the details and engaging a law firm, because it helps you really to set the stage. What do you allow your regulator to do?
And that's another thing. You have to kind of make a decision about what it is that you want your regulator to do. We wanted our regulator to protect the best interests of the consumer. And that sounds like something very, very basic, but that wasn't always the case with electricity as an example. So in electricity, and just to take a quick little sidebar on that one, in respect to electricity, it happened for years that the residential ratepayers were subsidizing the commercial.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah,
for years. And as the economy got more, I would say, got more difficult, as things became economically more difficult in Bermuda, like around the late 2000s, that was no longer appropriate. So we wanted a regulator who was going to look after the best interests of the public of Bermuda. And that was in order that they would have this very difficult job about them to balance the interests of business and industry and the individual ratepayer.
Of the different clients, let's say. Okay.
And essentially that kernel, that one small thing, really defines everything else that the regulator does. Everything else that we do hangs on that very thing. What is best for Bermuda? And that's not necessarily what's best for the ratepayer. For the residential ratepayer, sometimes you need to take a hit for the greater good of the economy. So, if that is your one guiding principle, then I think you're doing things well. Doesn't always feel that way.
It's a super challenge, especially if you start establishing, you're making changes, and not all stakeholders will perceive it similarly. Linked to that, did you also set up campaigns to, and you now have a regulator, people don't know what it is, what it does. Did you organize a campaign, an information campaign, something like that?
Yes. And I mean, that information campaign is ongoing because still there are a lot of people who think that up until a few years ago, the public opinion was that the regulator is simply the governmental arm of the utility, whatever that means. But they really thought that it was something to do with the utility, and no, it's quite independent. We went through an extensive period of consultation before the regulator was established, before the legislation was. That's essential in our legal processes. You absolutely must have that public consultation. So it wasn't a surprise when the regulator was established.
Okay, super. Others that have a question on this, like on the experiences of Bermuda.
Oh, maybe a question from my side. If you have seen let's say, the responsibilities of the regulator change already?
Yes.
From the moment you established it, yeah?
Yeah. So initially it was kind of all business, all about the business of making rates and approving rates and various policies that were purpose driven, which is another feature of our legislation. I can come back to that later. But I would say the most important thing that's a bit of a departure, and it's not outlined in their in the legislation. In order to protect the best interests of the public need to understand kind of the basics about energy use and energy conservation and what numbers are important. And I'm talking about energy primarily because that's my wheelhouse. I mean, our regulator also regulates other market sectors, but energy is the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart. They also do fuels. They also do, which is also part of energy, it's electricity. They do fuels, electricity, subsea cables, and telecommunications. So it's a multi-sector regulator. So ultimately, if the regulator is depending upon a fee that's attached to everybody's kilowatt hour usage, and it's per kilowatt hour. There's a tiny little segment of that rate that goes toward paying for the regulator, and that's so that the regulator remains independent. That there's no there are no allegations of the government funding it, so the regulator then better do what the government wants it to. There's none of that. Everybody funds the regulator. Every ratepayer funds the regulator. So they've gone much more deeply into outreach and education than certainly I would have expected, and it's a model that works for us so far.
Yeah. Okay. Any others? I think Eric, you don't have a regulator at this time, right?
Good morning. It is 1:35 in the Philippines, in Asia. Morning.
Yeah. Good morning.
Morning. I was absent last week because I was in the air. Okay, in Turks and Caicos, we are currently forming the multi-sector regulatory framework to cover electricity, water, fuel, and telecom. Currently, we have separate laws regulating all those sectors, but with the multi-sector regulatory framework, same as Jean. Hello, Jean. We met in CREP.
Yes, good to see you again.
In Miami. Yeah. Once the regulatory framework is established, there will be some changes with the existing laws. And just like Bermuda, we also hired a consultant from the Caribbean, and one of the terms of preference is to review the best practices in the Caribbean, and then after that output, we engage the services of another consultant from Canada, Nova Scotia. We met also in CREP 2 times, and he offered his services, and we engaged his services. And now we engaged another consultant, formerly argued the Supreme Court in the neighboring country. I will not name the name. So we are trying to fine tune. As expected, the utility opposed some of the section. Previously, I think in the first or second meeting of this training, I mentioned that we are supposed to go into the second reading of the energy or renewable energy. Yeah. Unfortunately, they went to the court and they have an injunction. So they did not allow the second reading, because after that third reading and it will be approved. So it's really a hard battle, because one problem in our case is the license. They were given a 50-year license. Lynn mentioned a while ago about long-term investments. So they want to protect their investments. So that's the problem. And their license will end on 2037. So, and we are still in 2023. So it will be very difficult. They will really challenge all our proposals in court. Thank you.
Yeah, especially because typically investments in grids, in electricity grids, are depreciated over long terms, like 50 years. So in that sense, if you cut that, then it's really difficult for them to make the case. For the others, is there any of the others that either have a regulator or don't have a regulator that are still thinking about something else? Like what we found in exchanging also Lucia with the islands she's working with is sometimes the regulators have a job to stimulate research and development, or to ensure that there is solidarity. I think that was covered already with Bermuda, the solidarity aspect. Anything else you're thinking of, or anything that the islands who don't yet have a regulator want to put on this board?
Sir, good afternoon. Here in Angola, we have a regulator that was initially set up to regulate telecoms and electricity. They started only with telecommunications. So right now we're looking at through consultancy and getting the energy regulation part of it up and running.
And what are the challenges that you face in that?
Well, for us, the major challenge would be most of our training would have been in the telecom space. So we now have to offer trainings, hirings, so forth, to be able to be effective in the energy space.
Yeah. Linked to that, Eric, when I can come back to that, you said that you asked the consultant to review best practices in the Caribbean. Do you know whether these reviews would be available afterwards to share with the other islands here?
Oh, I will ask the commissioner, and I will ask the government if that is a public document. But it has been approved and accepted by the former cabinet, the former government, and then we have a new government. They reviewed again. That's why they said there are areas for improvement. So I will check if it is available for the sharing.
And worst case we can clean it up if sensitive parts need to be out. But I think for all the others here, it would be, because that is how you learn a lot by sharing these experiences. So if this is available, then it would be a pity not to be able to share that. Okay, going back.
Jeannie also has a hand up, please.
Ooh, I can't see that. Jeannie.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I think there's also another piece of it that I left out. We didn't wake up one day and say, hey, we need to regulate the market. Yeah. We'd actually been regulating it for some time, but the regulator was under the auspices of the government. That was not an independent regulator. Yeah. And through that experience, we kind of felt our way, and we found out, so, we discovered things that worked, things that didn't work, things that we needed to do better, and things that we couldn't do because we weren't independent.
Yeah, so I think that's a relevant part. Yep.
That could be something of an evolution. So if you don't have a regulator, well, that may be okay. Maybe that's just point where you're at in your evolution, and you need to maybe have something in-house. So what we had initially was it was just price control. That's all it was and the regulation of electricity was actually under the Price Control Act. So the very first thing that we did was we took that responsibility from the Ministry of Finance and put it under our ministry, or the ministry that we were in at the time. So it could just be a matter of evolution, and it could just be a matter of starting somewhere. And maybe the somewhere that you start is only in rate making. And then maybe making some of those very basic decisions. Are we looking at price cap regulation, or are we looking at rate of return regulation? And then maybe go from there.
Yeah, and that is what I wanted to emphasize also. It's not you start a regulator and you know what it needs to do. It's you start somewhere with something that is a priority to you, whether it's rates or it's licenses or it's opening up the market or it's smart metering or it's whatever.
It's reliability.
Yeah, and that is where you actually have to start. And there is no right way, but I think exchanging these experiences, and I really like your engagement today, that is actually what can help the smaller ones here. And I think, coming back to the example of Tokelau last week, where we had 1,800 people, of Yell 600 people. Okay, Yell is connected to the Scottish market, but Tokelau not. It doesn't make any sense for 1,800 people to set up a separate entity. You can't do that. So yeah, indeed. Lucia, can I get back my slides?
Well, actually, there is a question from Andrea.
Andrea? Yeah. Go ahead.
I actually have a question for Jeannie and how they set up the regulator. Because I see similarities in where we're at, where we're heading, and stuff like that. And my question to you is, if you could tell a little bit of how your system looks like. Do you have more than one supplier, for example, of energy, more than one distributor? And also with that, the regulator that you now have, does he have a role in that area, or is it still, even though more independent, more about fixing tariffs or rates and stuff like that?
Shall we
I was
anticipate
going to say,
yes.
My question there is, Jeannie, because you have your presentation, is this addressed by your presentation, or do you want to answer it now and then we go into your presentation after?
Well, I was going to say, I think, as far as my presentation goes, I have to admit, I don't have a lot of slides. I had envisioned it as being quite interactive.
Okay.
So, we can talk about that. Really, all I wanted to talk about was the importance of the good regulation, and kind of our journey about how we're going forward with that. So I can answer some of that now.
But you can take your presentation now, and then I mean, I'm flexible with what we do, and even if we don't finish my part, then you know, worst case, we continue after the session.
Because I think that would be good. Yeah, that we have.
Can I just verify how long I've got to present?
Yes.
Well, especially because it's interactive. Lucia, there was something previewed in the scheme, but I mean, as long as you all learn from it, we're flexible.
Yeah, we have previewed about 20-25 minutes, but if you need more time, there is more questions, that's also okay. So
no, that's fine. And I do apologize. We've been okay. Full disclosure, we had a cyber attack back in September. So things that we thought we could do, we're struggling with, and so the lesson in that is make sure your cybersecurity is all up to date. So we've learned a hard lesson in that one. So yeah, I mean, I can start talking about what our electricity sector looked like. So initially, when we were regulating under the auspices of the Department of Energy. It was only one supplier, one main supplier, and still they do have the monopoly. They do have a larger market share, but there were no independent power producers apart from our waste to energy plant. We have a government-run waste to energy plant, and just to give you a quick little snapshot of that, it was never conceived as a way we could generate electricity for Bermuda and solve our energy problems. It was conceived instead as a means by which we could dispose of our trash. And so we thought, hey, while we're at it, we may as well make it work for us as well. So let's produce electricity with the waste heat. And that's pretty much what we did. So there was no grand plan of becoming an energy producer as such. It was a plan of let's make the most efficient use of our trash, which you've got to get rid of somehow anyway, because we're, like many of you, a beauty spot, right? Nobody wants to look at, our big landfill. And it's still there, although greatly reduced in size. But that it was just those two things initially. It was the electric utility. And just to give you an idea of the electric utility, it is a privately owned public utility. So what that means is that there are shareholders to whom the utility is responsible. It's a different situation than many other jurisdictions in which your government is a major shareholder. That wasn't the case with us. We did, however, get very deep discounts from the utility. So, but so did the hospitality sector. And who paid for those discounts was the ratepayer. So regulation grew out of the oil crisis of the 1970s, believe it or not. It was something that grew out of 1974, where oil prices were all over the place. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember. I barely am. I can remember as a very, very little girl hearing about all of this stuff. Didn't mean a thing to me then. And so it was the Price Commission that was established first. And so the Price Commission then became the Energy Commission. The Energy Commission then was dissolved once the regulator was stood up, and then but the independent regulator took over that responsibility. So it was a very slow evolution, and it certainly wasn't any grand plan that we said, hey, we need a regulator. Now, time's not on your side, so many of you, if you don't have a regulator, you're in the position of where, well, you need one. You need one to attract investment. You need one to grow your renewable energy sector. So moving on from there, just another little bit about our electricity system, if you will. Maximum demand is 118 megawatts. That was last measured in 2011. We've never reached that peak since then. So 118 megawatts. It is hub and spoke, meaning that generation generally takes place in the center of the grid, and it's transmitted outwards. That is also problematic because it's also not a system that's designed to take in power from various points. So as power is added in, it's going to be done very carefully. Again, anything that could, you think of it this way, anything that could upset the reliability of your system is something that probably needs to be regulated. Yeah. So start there too, and start looking at those sorts of problems. Where do I see issues cropping up? So with us, we saw, okay, we have to get away from fossil fuels. And for that, if the rationale behind that wasn't just about emissions, although that did perform part of it, but let's be honest with ourselves. If you live in a place like Bermuda and it's a tough economy and you've got people working very hard to make ends meet, the last thing they're worried about is sea level rise. The last thing they're generally worried about are those sorts of wider yet very critical issues. You know, things like hurricanes for Bermudians. Well, we just hunker down and we weather. We do the best we can through them. Our houses are stone. We've fared reasonably well in the past. So even the threat of increased hurricane strength or increased hurricane frequency wasn't enough to resonate with people and say, oh, we have to do something. So what really resonated with people, and I hate to boil it down to this, climate change, interest in climate change really is quite dependent on costs. And so the one thing that's very, very true, and if there's only one slide I could show, it's this one, and it's a chart. Correlation isn't causation. I get that, but in this case, it really is. You look at the cost of oil and how its volatility looks on a graph, and the volatility for food pricing is exactly the same.
Yeah, especially on islands. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, we reached a conclusion, and it wasn't even a very difficult one to sell to the public, of, well, you know, we need to become a bit more self-reliant, because we're exporting, and I'm sure that the picture looks the same for other islands. We export $100 million a year, probably more now, on fuel alone. And it just leaves the island, leaves our economy to literally be burnt. And yes, there's some economic benefit to be derived from that oil, but generally speaking, it does nothing to help create a more circular economy, which all of our islands need to be successful. So, you know, it's a difficult thing. So seeing that, and seeing that the need to have a much better handle on pricing and why things cost the way they cost, because now, you know, with all kinds of information out there, people will actually want to know. They're no longer content to simply pay their bill and grumble about it. They want to know, why is this costing so much? You know, is this a justified cost? So part of regulation is in part to justify those costs, to ensure that what we're paying is what we should be paying for electricity. And so, you know, that's another kind of genesis point of our regulator, or our regulatory system. And then we started thinking about, well, if we're going to attract innovators to the market, or not even innovators, if we're going to attract investors, how do we best do that? So we use a type of regulation, and you'll hear all kinds of Latin being used. We use ex ante regulation, which means that you know the rules before you even start. You know the rules of engagement before you enter the arena, so to speak. And that lends most investors a great deal of comfort, because they know the rules aren't going to change. They know, you know, if the rules change, there are injunctions. As our friend Eric has told us about his difficulty there. We were very fortunate in that we didn't have licenses even before. So, you know, there was no license. There was instead an act of Parliament. So there was the 1951 Belco Act that allowed Belco, our local electric company, to operate. So recently Belco had been sold, all of that sort of stuff. So there are big concerns. If your utility is owned and operated by a local group, that's wonderful, but that local group can be bought and sold. And that's what happened to us in Bermuda. Our utility was purchased by a Canadian utility. And so we had to make sure that there was some framework in place for that transfer. Luckily enough, the timing worked out that there was, but it very nearly wasn't. What if that purchase happened 5 years before the regulator was stood up? So these are all very real concerns. And another good point of timing for creating your regulator could be that this very thing, like, is there a license expiring soon? Yep. Now might be the time to act. So even if you couldn't before, maybe you can right now. All things to consider. So let's look at how we maybe developed so the first things first is you develop policy, right? So the government's policy was very, very important. The government of Bermuda established policy back in 2011 through the 2011 White Paper for Energy. So that covered all of energy. And it was very aspirational. I think we've departed quite a bit from those days where, we need maybe more refined policy, but I don't know that we're ever going to have another white paper that was that sweeping and broad. But in that white paper, it charted a path to, I want to say, complete self-reliance in respect to energy by, I want to say 2050, but I could be incorrect, and 85% renewable penetration by 2035. We might miss that. It's only 11 years away at this point. So it might have been somewhat aspirational to make that goal, but you've got to start somewhere. What's important to you? What's important to the public? So that white paper took a great deal of public consultation before it was published, before it was settled on. And that public consultation took over, I want to say it was over 2 years, because that consultation was going on before I came on board. And I was actually, I'm actually the government's first director of energy. So that was back in 2009. So those consultations were in 2008. The paper was published in 2011, and we did it ourselves. We didn't hire a consultant for this, because we thought, okay, policy is what we want, what our country wants, what's best for us. And we didn't feel at that point that a consultant was going to be able to offer much value in that regard, except for perhaps the level of polish on our statement at the end of the day. So so that's where we started. Can I just pause for one moment? I've got somebody knocking at my door.
Yeah, it's fine.
So let me pause for just a second and perhaps some questions that you can think of before I move on. This would be a good time. So let me just
so for the others, Ginny already put a lot of things on the table. Anything that you think she should clarify?
This is Eric. Can I briefly comment?
Yeah.
Ginny's statement. While the Turks and Caicos Islands hired consultants, the government reviewed their output and treat it as a working document. We will not accept as is. That's why we hired another consultant to review again, and we discuss with them. Thank you.
Yeah. So what you actually say is different opinions matter, different views help, whether, for different aspects or for just to have different views on the same matter, because it's something complex, like Ginny also says. What I see coming back in, and the ones who are working on setting up a regulator, what I see coming back in what Ginny says is the typical principles of energy regulators, which I added in my slides as well, and we'll come back to that. It's transparency. Actually, she didn't really touch that yet. But the investor consumer protection, when she said that we need to have a hostile environment for investors to come in, she brought that with another angle as well. It's not just to have that hostile environment for others to invest, but it was also when she talked about Belco, the utility that was purchased by the Canadian utility to set the rules under which they could operate. So it's also the boundary conditions for external investors, not only for a new investment, but to take over something that is already there. Is that something others of you have been have seen as well, that that external investors are interested in buying existing assets and existing companies in energy? Is there any other island where you see that happening? I assume if they come to Bermuda to buy the utility, they might be interested in buying more utilities. Is that the case?
Well, just to maybe briefly address that, Robert Moons, also from the GO program. I believe across the OCTs or OTs, we have not seen that so much, but it's certainly happening across the Caribbean. So the CARICOM countries like Barbados, Jamaica, and so on, they have either fully privatized or partially privatized utility companies. And that indeed then underscores the need to have a regulatory body to ensure the market operation.
And is it typically pension funds? Jeannie, in a second, the word back to you, but who buys a utility?
I mean, it would be large private investors from abroad, so often US-based funds, hedge funds, or other big
these
firms,
kind of things, because it's a stable
energy funds. Who, in some cases, like the case of Contour Global in Bonaire and CEPEM in the Dominican Republic, it's a kind of a global energy company that has small utilities in small islands, and then they have like a centralized office to do knowledge sharing. This is also happening in telecoms with, for example, Digicel across the Caribbean. So that model you see with Contour Global or CEPEM out of the Dominican Republic owning assets across Central America and the Caribbean.
Okay, thank you. Jeannie, back to you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's fine.
And I was going to say I have an office that's something of a fishbowl, so people kind of stick their heads over the glass barrier and ask me questions. So anyway, I was going to say that in our case, as far as the purchase was concerned, we were subsumed by a larger energy corporation. Belco was purchased by a company called Algonquin, and the subsidiary that operates Belco is called Liberty. So I think your regulators definitely very much required for setting those boundaries, as you said. It's very, very important to have those sort of boundary conditions set. I'm not sure we did that especially well in the beginning, and I'm not sure we saw that one coming. I'm not sure we actually saw the day where Belco would be purchased by somebody else. But in any case, we started. So I said we started by developing our policy. Well, one of the things that became very important, and one of the things that we wanted to do differently with the legislation when it became time to draft the legislation that would frame the whole regulatory environment, was we wanted to make sure it was purpose-driven, at least in the instance of electricity, where we had this opportunity to kind of hang all the legislation off of purposes. And the purposes of our act are to ensure that the customer is paying the lowest possible price. So at the same time, ensuring that the utility is kept whole. And now what we're struggling right now with is with the definition of what does it mean to be kept whole. So we'll come back to that one in a while as well. So if you are a utility operating in Bermuda in electricity, we can guarantee you're not going to lose your shirt. You're not going to lose money, but neither are we necessarily going to guarantee a certain rate of profit. That is up to the regulator as far as what they want to do. Is it going to be a price cap, or is it going to be a rate of return? And I say that to be a little bit cheeky, because in regulation, you'll find that there's rarely a purity of one approach or the other, and it's often a blend of the two. So ours is quite blended in that, a price is set, but the profit margin can vary. So if the utility operates efficiently, they make a better profit. Is that necessarily fair? Because you could have things like reliability issues. Well, reliability is also a purpose of our act. So it's to ensure that reliability stays there. Arguably, Bermuda has been successful in the past because of its robust infrastructure, its robust electricity infrastructure. Bermuda is a little unlike some of our neighbors. We've had electricity on island in a reliable fashion since I want to say 1904. So that's also somewhat unusual. And we also, because of our size, Bermuda's tiny. We are only 21 square miles. I don't know how many square kilometers that is, but it's not many. Because of our small size, we never really had a challenge with rural electrification, as an example. Yeah. So our challenges are different than some of our neighbors who have been less reliably connected, let's say, than Bermuda. We also don't have a lot of what's called non-technical line losses. So we don't have a lot of electricity theft either, but it does happen. So I know that's a challenge in some jurisdictions as well. And, you know, it happens, and it happens where prices are high and the GDP is not commensurate with the cost of living. Anyway, all of that said, let's get back to the purposes of the act. So the purposes are reliability, sustainability. That's actually written into our act. Environmental responsibility, customer pricing, customer well-being, customer safety is another one. So there are several purposes, and you know, at any one time, those purposes can conflict with one another.
Yeah.
So in the act as well, it's very well defined about what the minister can and can't do. The minister responsible for any of the utilities cannot interfere on any matter that's live before the authority. So in other words, if there's a rate case going on, the minister cannot. It is absolutely ultra vires. He cannot do this. He cannot say, you'll lower the price, or you'll make it this, or you'll make it that. What he can do, however, is reprioritize the purposes of the act and declare one purpose overriding all others, as an example. And he's done that from time to time, where sometimes it's pricing that needs to be considered, and sometimes it's safety. But it's up to the minister to make that decision based on the feedback he gets from the public, from the constituency, because ultimately he's a politician. He exists in the political realm. He does not exist in the operational realm. So that's a very important distinction to keep in mind in terms of how our government works. So, and defining that those responsibilities, those mutual responsibilities, is really critical as well. So when the public rails and shouts at the sky about why our prices cost, you know, why things cost what they cost, the minister can only do so much. It's really, so much is up to the regulator. So there are also rate-making principles brought into the legislation as far as the feed-in tariff is concerned. So the feed-in tariff also speaks to certain purposes, and one of the purposes is, or one of them, yeah, I guess it's best defined as a purpose. But one of the purposes is to ensure that people want to invest in solar technologies. How that happens? Well, again, you try to not be prescriptive with your regulator, and that's also a really important point. Nowhere in our legislation will we say we guarantee a certain percentage of return on investment. We don't do that. We don't say electricity shall never cost more than this, or it's just far too prescriptive, and it ties the hands of the regulator. So you want to allow the regulator a certain amount of latitude to consider different possibilities. So as an example, one of the possibilities that the regulator may consider going forward here in Bermuda may be something like performance regulation instead of rate of return or price cap. And maybe that element of performance is brought in, so that if the utility operates with a certain level of efficiency, then they get to make a bit more money. And it's all about money. It really is all about the profit with them. You can't really, you don't have any teeth without that. So with all of these wonderful things that we had in place, 5 years down the road now. So that was back in, it's more than 5 years now. So those laws, the legislation framing electricity were enacted in 2016. That's when the law was passed. The regulator didn't take responsibility for the electricity sector until 2017. So that's another thing, is the minister can choose what parts of the legislation are brought into force and when. So that's also important. And transitional provisions are also really important. So how do you make that transition from a government regulator to an independent regulator? So there were some rules of play that had to be established, and all of it was done with consultation with the utility. They didn't like everything that we did, but we tried to make sure that it was fair. And that's where your regulator really needs to sit, is in that kind of gray area. So you may think, or some regulators, and this is a challenge that we've had from time to time, some regulators may think, oh, well, it's about number crunching. So if I can justify the numbers, then I just crunch the numbers and that's the result. Well, rate making is so much more than that. If all you need is a number cruncher, you don't need a regulator, you need an administrator. A regulator is the one who exists in that gray area between black and white, or this and that. There's a lot of fuzzy space in there. And that's where your regulator needs to be. So long as your regulator can justify their decisions, and that justification could be in policy, it could be in purposes of the law, or it could be in mathematics. But so long as they can justify their position. Another piece that's written into our law is you can't take the regulator to court. If you're the utility and you're not happy with the decision, if you don't like it, it's kind of tough luck.
Okay, so you don't allow, okay, yeah, that's, yeah,
interesting. You can only take the regulator to court if they've made an error in law. So if you can prove that they've acted outside the law or not in accordance with the law, then you've got a case to stand on. Otherwise, it's your tough luck. Now, utilities are very clever, and they'll find ways that they can take you to court by saying, "Oh, but you really did make a mistake, and I don't like your decision." So. So it's
just to see a bit on the others. Any specific questions you have so far? Because Jeannie's been saying a lot. I've been trying to note down some things so I can, reflect it also in the French session that we have afterwards. Is there anyone who has a question? Andrea, the Aruba team, April?
Andrea, you're our official question asker.
I actually do, It's the thing you said last about litigation and stuff like that. And my question is, the regulators that you guys have, does that regulator, does he put down like guidelines, general guidelines that everybody has to follow? Or is he also, does he have the authority to make decisions in individual cases? Do I make sense? You can make like regulation and say, for example, companies or utilities in this sector, they have to, these are the requirements, and they set these general rules. But then you can also have a regulator that does have authority to make decisions in like really against one supplier or individual cases. Do you guys make a distinction in that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because one of the things, so our regulatory authority is born out of the telecommunications sector, and that's a much livelier sector, speaking market-wise, than the energy sector, right? So one of the ways in which the regulator can treat different market participants differently is if they have significant market power. So another purpose of the utility, of the regulator, is to ensure that the entity that holds significant market power, or SMP, doesn't abuse the market, doesn't do anything that's anti-competitive, that prevents other players from coming into the market. So you had asked earlier, I think it was you as well, Andrea, I'm not sure. you'd asked earlier about if there were other participants. So back 10 years ago, there were only two. And government as a participant wasn't really in it for the money. We were in it to dispose of our trash, and it was nice to make the money. However, we found out that we weren't being treated fairly in respect to the cost of the cost that we were causing to be avoided for the utility. They were making money by buying our electricity. So that really was unfair. There was sort of a bit of a double dip there. So pricing was renegotiated so that the government was given a fairer, more appropriate price for its electricity generation. Our generation isn't as reliable as the regulators, as the utilities. So our power is worth less because, if there's a general strike, as an example, nobody thinks that, our incinerator is an essential service. So they get to go on strike. And if that reliability isn't there, you can't claim to be worth as much, the same as what the utility is. The utility promises a 99.9 something percent reliability. And so we're not the utility, government wasn't the utility. So fast forward another couple of years and renewable energy starts coming into its own. So when I started in 2009, there was almost no solar on the system. There were a few people who had a system here and there. So but at this point, we have 11 megawatts of distributed solar, and we have a 6 megawatt solar farm. So that regulation helped shape that development as well. It just wasn't happening before, and not because the technology wasn't there. It was because there was no advantage to it.
Yeah.
So
no advantage, but also probably no investor consumer protection.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the utility could, pick, choose, and refuse who got connected and who didn't.
Yeah.
So that was another thing, was universal access to the grid, provided that technical requirements were met.
Yeah.
So that was a very important provision, because we wouldn't want to force anything that would compromise the reliability or the safety of the grid. So as an example, any solar PV system, be it a rooftop solar or be it our solar farm, has to be protected so that if power goes out on the grid, it's not still feeding to the grid and electrocuting linemen. So those sorts of, I think it's called anti-islanding protection.
Yeah.
And that's a requirement of your interconnection agreement. The regulatory authority also has the right to review every interconnection agreement. They have to essentially approve of it before they're connected. So that's another kind of safeguard for the customer, for the smaller power producer, that they're being dealt with fairly. That said, our solar farm, part of the bidding process for it was who's got the lowest price. So their price is 10.3 cents a kilowatt hour. And, that's far below grid parity. And as it turns out, I'm sure that our solar farm would love to, sell to somebody else, because they didn't make the money that they thought they were going to make on it. That's what they agreed to. And that's, everything looked fine to the utility. To the regulator. So the power purchase agreement was approved. We also have something called a standard contract. So you don't have to. So it used to be, time was that you had to go as an individual to Belco and say, will you interconnect me? And do I get any electrons produced? and
maybe if I can interrupt, Jeannie, sorry. I think it's really good that we have this really specific example, and I think people are hearing a lot of useful information. I just want to mention that the presentation that Len started is really sort of outlines these different aspects, and the presentation will be provided to you after the training. I don't know, Len, if there is specific points.
No, I think
from
No, I think one of the things that Jeannie is now already referring to is the topic of tomorrow. That's the pricing. One thing though, Jeannie, that I would like you to come back to after maybe I go through the theory is the aspect of solidarity in how you. I mean, the regulator is key in ensuring solidarity for all the consumers connected, and it's part of what you said earlier, putting the customer first, and looking here at the Miro board to see how it was formulated, but ensuring that what is the best for Bermuda as a key driver. So what I would suggest is, because we have the Faroe Islands presenting in 13 minutes, is that I'm going to go through the theory a bit more. And then after the Faroe Islands, Jeannie, if you can come back to how in the regulatory design, you kind of integrated that aspect of solidarity. Would that work?
Sure. Okay. Can I just ask, I just have something. We're also in our budget cycle right now, so I am so sorry. I also have a few other things that are tugging at me right now. So may I ask when we would be...
Could you come back quarter to what's the next hour there?
Yeah.
In like just over half an hour from now, something?
That's fine. That's fine. If you don't mind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute myself and stop my video. And
then we start waving when we need you. Yeah. Okay, Lucia, can I have my slides back?
Yes, I'm sharing them right now.
Yeah. So there we go. Yeah. So next one, please. So there are a few things that Jeannie already mentioned, and I think that is something you all recognize. First of all, independence. She clearly said, okay, the policy can say this, but when it comes down to the specifics, that is the part of the regulator. So that is seen as one of the key principles. Transparency, she didn't emphasize that so much, but we'll come back to that. It's super important. She did mention invest and consumer protection. And then there's actually the fourth one, which is related to solidarity. That is going to be mainly the topic of tomorrow in the prices, but it's a key element. The regulator's job is to make sure that there is fairness in the system. Two other things that she mentioned that weren't really considered, aren't typically considered as the main principles is, of course, safety and reliability. But of course, that is evident that it needs to be included. Lucia, can I get the next one? So when it comes to independence, that means that they're free from any influence of external sources in its decision-making. That mainly means that they're independent from the legal and the policy system. And that's super important, but that's not the only thing. And she mentioned that as well, I think, in the Miro board. It is not self-evident, especially not in the beginning, as the budget typically comes from the government, especially in the first year, but generally the first 2 to 3 years of the operation. They're now having an independent regulator that takes the cost from the operation and that takes the cost for the operation from the grid tariff. But when you set up your regulator or when you expand its services, be aware that, of course, the money has to come from somewhere. And if the money comes from the government, that creates a tie, which at least gives the idea of not being super independent. Another thing that is really important is to make sure that the regulator has enough human resources and tools to do its job independently and correctly. Because, of course, if you say you're from now on responsible for licenses, but you're not getting the human resources to do that and not the training that is necessary for it, then of course it's something you have to do, but you can't do. So that is super important as well. Lucia, the next one. Transparency. So transparency actually means that you're clear about what you're doing. You're clear about the processes and the decisions you've been making and the justification there too. And the reason why that transparency is super important is it creates legitimacy. And linked to that, it creates confidence. And those two are super important to make sure you attract and you retain investment. How do you typically do that transparency? One of the ways to do that is presenting your annual report with sufficient details, going down to how much your operation costs, to which disputes you've been solving, which consultations you put public, these kind of things to really show what you're doing. And where you're organizing a consultation as a regulator, having that online, having it publicly available, having it open long enough, that are the aspects that really contribute to making sure there is confidence in your operation. Next one, Lucia. And then we come down to what she already said. So it is important that you attract investments. It could be investments literally taking over your utility, or it could be investors in a new wind farm or a wave energy system or whatever. So what you want to make sure is that people have interest and have the feeling of confidence in the fact that the system is going to remain reliable, and that what you step into in your investment, the assumptions that you make based on the regulation and the legislation that is valid today, that will keep on being in place, so that not tomorrow, all of a sudden, you're no longer allowed to inject between certain hours or something like that. So it has to be reliable to allow my investment to at least deliver me what I need it to deliver. That has to happen towards the government, towards the consumers, but also, of course, towards the suppliers. So who's then typically involved in setting up the regulation? Of course, the regulator itself, who can clearly also in the annual report express the limitations and the barriers related to limitations of its operation. But of course, what you already heard, the government typically setting it up, but allowing also the enabling framework, the legal framework to allow the regulator to operate what he needs to operate. Local authorities could be engaged as well, especially when utilities were meant to be or were owned by local authorities, which you typically also see when there is the mix between urban and rural communities. And then you see typically that in rural communities, grids are often more owned bottom up because it was much less interesting to invest in them, and it was much less a priority. So often it was a grassroots initiative setting it up themselves. Courts and tribunals, although we heard that some of them weren't allowed to go to court, what you typically see is at a certain moment, they might have to justify themselves in court. Okay, next one.
We have a question from Gilbert. It's the question is, what do you mean by regulator being autonomous from legislation? What about competition legislation?
Gilbert, what do you mean with what about competition regulation?
Legislation.
Hi, it is something you mentioned in the slide before.
Yeah.
That the authority operates completely autonomous.
Yeah.
And I didn't catch it well. What do you mean autonomous from legislation?
Well, they are given a legal space in which they're allowed to work, which says, for example, you can set the prices. Concrete example in Europe these days is indeed a price gap. Due to the Ukrainian war, the prices went insane. And so what suppliers here did was they would ask an insane price to end consumers, while sometimes they had long-term power purchase agreements in place. So some of them, especially suppliers that were producers as well, they made a large profit. So what the European Commission did is they recently developed a legislation that is to be implemented by all the member states, and the regulators have to actually implement that in the tariff setting and in the auditing of the suppliers. That is a consumer protection. So within that legal framework, which now they're given a new room to work in, they are independent. The Commission cannot say, nor a national authority can say how they have to do it. They just have to make sure they align with it. So they have no room to not align with it, but how exactly they align with it, how they set up the procedure, that is their freedom to operate. Does that clarify it?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Lucia.
One question. As we have a few minutes before we go to the example of Faroe Islands, do you want to walk through the next few slides or explain what they consist of?
Well, I'm just checking. We could do the bodies because it's a small book. We just did the bodies. So I'm just checking how big the next one is. The next one is a longer one. Though no, I think it's fine. It's doable. Okay. Yeah. So I think it already came to surface through Jeannie's talk. There are several reasons to establish a regulatory authority. And that is, as she said, we had actually one main supplier, and then we had the waste incineration plan. Sometimes it is making sure that the market is more open. That is a super important aspect. What she also said was preparing for a potential investment, which at the moment that they did it, they didn't know, but that buying over the utility is clearly one of that. So setting up the rules and the guidelines in which such things can happen, in the boundaries, as I said it earlier, in which a utility needs to operate, or what Eric said, I think earlier, I don't know who said it, that the license for the utility was until 14 years from now, something. Of course, investments are on a 50-year plan. So that that organization that setting up the rules is clearly the role of a regulator, at least if the legal authority provides that room. So overviewing how, let's say, constraining how incumbent suppliers exercise their monopoly, that could be an important one. And it could be also linked to opening the markets a little bit that leads to a more cost-efficient expansion where you would allow renewables to come in. That decentralized operation is an important one. The structure of the sector, which links to how many actors do we allow? Do we allow individual production? Rooftop solar is one of the things that is typically there, where we see that it is not self-evident to allow it. And then providing incentives for operating efficiently and providing quality of services. That's what I said earlier. You can then, as a grid operator, have a longer term plan because you're no longer constrained by shorter policy terms. You can now say, I have these 10-year investment plans. And you might want to stimulate energy conservations and R&D, which is not only in the exploitation of the grid, but you could do it more widely. We see regulators that really work on energy conservation in a broader sense, helping consumers to become more energy efficient as well. Next slide, Lucia. Then the regulatory authority needs to make sure that they protect consumers from abuse by firms with substantial market power. And that is what you typically see in monopolies, but also just what happened in the whole of Europe, which is why the Commission asked regulators to take action. Support the investment, that what we said earlier, and promote economic efficiency. And this is typically when you see that the regulator asks for a benchmark for the grid operators, like how much does your operation currently cost? And then following that, they say they may compare it with other utilities in the area. And then they might say, okay, we need you to operate more efficiently, and you get an X-year plan in which you have to decrease your costs by 5-6%. And that is where it literally says economic efficiency. It could also be related to the grid operation where they have to reduce their losses, and they have to do it in the most efficient way. That means if batteries are your most efficient way of doing it, then you're forced to look into batteries. But if, thicker cables are the solution, then you're requested to actually make that balance to see, okay, where do you go and invest? Do we already have our speaker? Yeah, we have Terji. So I suggest that I can continue afterwards and that we first go to the Faroe Islands.
All right. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Jeannie. I see you're back with us. Hi. All right. So now we have presentation from Faroe Islands. We have with us Mr. Thierry Nielsen, if I'm saying that right. I saw you're with us here today. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, we hear you. And you'll be talking to us about the integrating renewables in Faroe Islands power systems on heading to 100% renewables. Please present yourself. I don't want to go into the details, and go ahead with the presentation. Thank you.